Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm very happy to have Monish with us. He is a good friend, and we've been familiar with each other for a few years now, I think. And he's been in the space of AI and helping companies build products for quite some time, and solve major problems. And I'm very excited and happy to have him with us today. Just very quickly about him, he has been passionate about AI for a long time. Over 10 years, he built a system that could teach players how to win a pool billiard. Today, he brings this passion and experience to help businesses apply AI within their products and processes and drive results. Monish drives customer-centric culture and brings his curiosity, passion for problem solving, and enthusiasm for technology to the customers. Prior to founding Gradient Ascent, I forgot to say that he's the founder of a company called Gradient Ascent. He's held several product management and professional service kind of roles in a number of different technology companies. And he has been speaking at various events, and I'm very excited to have him here with us. And he has a master's degree in finance and financial law from University of London, and an undergraduate degree in system design engineering from University of Waterloo. So thank you so much for being with us today, Monish, and I'm very excited to hear your talk. So please take it away.
Thank you, Amir. A big fan of the organization as well. So I was honored to be, I'm honored to be speaking here today and talking about one of sort of my favorite topics, which is sort of product ideation. Often sort of that's really the most, I don't want to say the most exciting, but it's definitely one of the most exciting parts of the journey of sort of bringing a product or a solution to the users and customers. And this is when, possibilities are endless. So you really sort of get to imagine very creative and innovative things. So I hope to sort of share with you today what I've learned from my experiences in terms of working with clients and my own previous experiences to talk about how effectively we can do product ideation. So just a little bit of sort of the background around Gradient Ascent. We've been in business for almost 4 years now. Worked on over 30 very much sort of machine learning and AI focused projects in a variety of sort of different verticals, and with many startups, but also large corporations. And we're also hiring. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out. But by doing that in almost all of these projects, oftentimes what we had to sort of think about or do was identify the right project. Oftentimes it was even working with clients to even ideate and figure out what they should do, right? Like what are all the possibilities in front of them that they could be working on before they pick which one to work on. So we'll really sort of focus on the ideation journey during this presentation today. So, I'm sure you've all kind of seen this slide. There's lots of these landscapes. If you do a Google search for these landscapes, there's hundreds of them out there. And here is one for sort of data and AI for 2019. And sort of when you look at this, you kind of wonder like, okay, well, are we at this problem where, anything you can, really meaningfully do in terms of a product or a project is already being done? What's left for me? There's like 1,000 companies on this list. Everything from enterprise applications focused on agriculture all the way to sort of sales and department focused things, from sales to security, right? There's just sort of really no shortage of things that are out there and people are working on. This doesn't even sort of capture all of them, just a few of them. So it's easy to kind of look at this and be almost scared that, okay, well, what can we do that's interesting, innovative, that can sort of make a difference? Whereas when I sort of look at this, I kind of go, no, I mean, there's so much opportunity out there. We are very fortunate that we get to work on really something that we love to do, which is, at least for me, machine learning and AI, but also at an exciting place in this journey, exciting time in this journey, where there is a lot that we could be doing to drive innovation and sort of inventive products and projects, right? There's just no shortage. And I'm a big believer that it's still very much the beginning, right? Like, we're still essentially looking at the world how it was in the past and trying to plug AI into it versus sort of reimagining sort of a new way of doing things. So there's just so much opportunity out there. And when we sort of think about ideation in context of this, it should really make you very excited. So, how do I sort of think about ideation, and especially sort of when we are working with clients, right? So the question is really the one that I get asked often is, great, I've heard about this thing, I know a little bit about it. What do I do with it? Right? Where is the impact? What are the possibilities that we have within our business or our space? And I just want to be careful, right? Like, sort of what I'm focusing on here is more ideation, not prioritization, right? Ideation, you want it to be open-ended. You want to really go wide, cast a very wide net, and catch as many ideas and possibilities. Some of them very wild ones, because there's often a lot of insight in there and opportunity in there. So we're really focused on ideation versus prioritization, which is inherently sort of a narrowing exercise, where you're not trying to sort of cast a wide net. You're actually sort of saying, okay, now I have all these ideas and opportunities or problems. How do I sort of pick which one that I spend time on? We'll talk about that a little bit later, but for now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to sort of focus on ideation. So the assumption that we really start with is that there is sort of opportunities everywhere, right? So if you start with a very closed mind that, okay, well, everything that you could do is already being done, it doesn't necessarily work in your favor. You really want to start with a very broad approach. And so generally, when we are doing this type of an ideation session, you want to, you can obviously do this by yourself, but I highly recommend to do this as part of team in front of lots and lots of whiteboard space, and start to sort of think about where are the opportunities to automate, right? And that's a very sort of low-hanging fruit type of opportunity. And what I tend to look for are verbs, right? Because verbs are actions, and actions can be automated. So how do you sort of start by asking those questions in your organization? What are these core actions, processes, really verbs? What do you do? Because that's when you can start to sort of identify opportunities to automate. So, okay, a verb maybe we process a lot of documents, or I read a lot of stuff, or we analyze lots of images, or we make decisions on who to give loans or not. And as you can kind of start to see, a lot of those verbs are fundamentally this is not limited to AI, by the way, it's computing in general. That's really what you are automating, because you're automating an action. Sometimes you can do this without AI, but obviously with machine learning and AI, you can do a lot more and a lot better and a lot more sort of subtle things. So I often sort of look for those verbs, because that's sort of a lot of opportunity. And that ties into like a specific type of verb, right? So the sort of decisions and judgment, right? Like I make a decision on something. Okay, that's a very classic way of sort of thinking about a classification problem, right? And what we are fairly good at is rapid decisions and automating those. So that ends up being sort of another area where you can analyze a business or a process or a product or a journey of a customer and kind of say, okay, here is the decision they're making. Can I make it easier for them, right? And a classic example is sort of a recommendation or a Netflix recommendation, right? Because if you can make that decision easier, faster, and less friction, with less friction, people tend to sort of do that more often. Sort of the entire purchase cycle, sort of the core insight that is that the more you reduce friction, the more sales you get, right? So that's sort of how do you sort of reduce that friction of decision making? The other way I like to sort of think about these things is to separate out product from process, right? So sort of, and product, I'm sort of thinking about this from a very broad perspective, almost as an offering, right? So typically a product is like a laptop or a table or like the shirt that I'm wearing. So that's product. But broadly, when you sort of think about a product, is anything that a company provides to their customers, right? So that may be a service, that may be advice, right? That could be professional services, or that could be a trip. That is sort of a product that a company offers. So how you think about product innovation, sort of how can I bring machine learning? And by the way, I use the word machine learning and AI interchangeably here. How can I bring these tools to make a product better, right? And better is a very broad term, but that's really the idea. How do I innovate around a product versus how do I innovate around a process, right? So process is typically something that's internally to the organization of how something goes from a lead to a sale, or how a customer support request goes from being created to actually being resolved. So you have a lot of processes from payroll to HR to finance to legal. How do you sort of apply AI to sort of innovate there? And I think the opportunities in both of these spaces are different, right? Like they're not the same. How you innovate around a product, you're trying to sort of build a feature that somehow uses machine learning, versus process where typically, and not always, but typically it boils down to some form of automation. Like how do I make this faster, cheaper, better, right? And when you're sort of thinking about this, this tends to sort of opens people's minds in terms of looking outside the organization versus inside the organization. And when you're looking inside the organizations for processes, understanding the org structure and sort of looking at specific use cases within those org structures gets very interesting, right? So sales has fairly standard processes across organizations. What can you sort of do there? I also sort of get people to think about and ask sort of what seem like weird questions, right? Like, what are you afraid of, right? Like, what are your sort of fear points, right? Because those are typically very sort of constrained things, and they bring up meaningful opportunities to innovate, right? We are afraid that we can't scale better. Okay, so can I bring in some automation to help you scale better? Or opportunity that it's not that we are afraid of scale, it's that we want to grow faster. So can you help us optimize something we're doing, improve the quality of our product, or identify better leads so that we can grow faster? So it's sort of fear versus opportunity. Same things with buzz versus value. Oftentimes, what's valuable in a tangible sense, right, like sort of dollars and cents, versus what might generate purely sort of a marketing buzz type of an idea, like oh cool, we built a prototype that does this, this, and this, right? Car companies do that all the time. So how do you sort of get yourselves, and potentially if you are in a role where you're working with an internal or external client, how do you sort of get them to think about that? Similarly, like long-term versus short-term, right? So what do you need done now? So what are sort of, again, opportunities or problems now versus, what is your long-term vision, right? And in same way to sort of think about small versus big. When you sort of start asking these questions, you're forcing yourself and people to think about a problem very differently, or their business very differently. And that's really the crux of what we're trying to do. We're trying to find problems, in some ways, sort of fall in love with them, and then ideate a solution around those, right? And oftentimes what you will sort of trip into is like, wait a minute, this is a great problem, but it's very much an R&D problem. Like I can't do this now. So sort of understanding and knowing and recognizing what are good ideas for things you can do now, right? They're applied sort of machine learning, and that's sort of what we do. But versus what are problems where you're like, you know what, this is going to take a while, right? Like this is not like we need to do a significant amount of R&D, or not just we, but somebody else, or you need to go engage with a research institution or Amir's team, right, to sort of really drive that R&D. So sort of start to think about what is machine learning good at, right? Like there's a class of problems that it's really good at, and sort of work backwards to say, okay, because I know we can do this well, are there a set of problems I can go and solve? In general, that's a terrible idea. But when you're sort of doing that type of exercise in context of a whole bunch of other ways to ideate, it actually works quite well. Oftentimes, it also boils down to organization, sort of just like, nobody likes doing this. Nobody wants this job, right? Like it's dull, it's repetitive. Can you automate it, right? Like I think in some ways, sort of asking people, what do you hate doing, leads to a very interesting conversation in terms of ideation and opportunities, right? The other way we often look at is within organizations, what data do you have that's highly differentiated, right? So, other people within your industry wouldn't have it. Your competitors may not have it, just because the way you've been operating, you have been sort of collecting this type of data. Because if you can ideate around that differentiated data, that can yield an enormous amount of benefit. We were working with a financial services client where, for whatever reason, for historical reasons, they were actually collecting a lot of activity type of data. And being able to use that data, and again, having that history for the last 15, 20 years, to then build better lending models or customer satisfaction or conversion models was incredibly valuable. And again, we wouldn't necessarily have sort of thought about that unless we kind of went, wait a minute, like you have a pool of data that other people just sort of don't have. This one's an interesting one, right? Because as we deploy new technologies, we create new problems, right? And this is not limited to machine learning, but as the world is changing, more and more boring things need to get done, right? Like that never really goes away. We automate something here, and it creates something a little bit boring, sort of plumbing type of work somewhere there. If you're sort of thinking about sort of machine learning, right? Like suddenly data labeling, right, has become this massive problem, and annotation and collection and organization and workflows around that. Those often actually lead to interesting challenges as well. As you can you're probably starting to get a feel for how we approach this. We ask a lot of questions, and different types of questions, and different ways of questions. And by no means am I about to, or I can really give you a comprehensive list. But what I would like you to sort of think about, and the thought I would leave you with is, fall in love with the problem and ask a lot of questions, right? Like ask a lot of questions to understand an organization, a problem, a process from many different perspectives, right? The other one we often use is sort of, there's dozens of these out there, right? Like almost every business school has its own innovation framework. And often for especially larger businesses, it helps to sort of think about these different frameworks and leverage them within your ideation process as well, so that you are not sort of getting boxed into something or sort of very narrow class of problems. It kind of forces you to sort of think broadly. The next one is almost, again, right? Like, who do you compete with, right? Sort of, the famous quote from Picasso, right? Great artists steal. It's not going to get you that far, but oftentimes you kind of have to sort of look at your industry or other industries where there's analogous sort of, value chains to kind of say, okay, like who is doing innovative things, and can we beg, borrow, steal from that? Because, as I was sort of showing you in that last slide, there's hundreds and thousands of companies who are trying to solve different problems. You may often find that, wait a minute, they can't do a good job of solving it for whatever reason, but because you have differentiated data or process or reach, for whatever reason, you might be actually in a better position to do that. And last but not least, I mean, to be honest with you, this is one of my favorites, which is really empathize with the customer, right? Like the end user. So if you are doing sort of a client engagement, again, whether it's internal or external, if you are trying to understand who are they trying to impact, right? Like who is the end customer here, and understanding their journey and how you can sort of impact things there can lead to a pretty interesting set of ideas, questions, and opportunities, right? As I said, like this list of questions is very long, and you will come up with your own that I've never thought of before. But here are some of the ways that have sort of served us quite well in sort of variety of sort of different situations. And then I want to sort of talk about this very differently, right? So what I sort of like to often say is almost everything, all the previous set of questions I just talked about were very bottom up. They essentially sort of looked at the world as it is and tried to say, okay, how can I make it better? Whereas I think a lot of the very innovative and frankly riskier sort of ideas come when you kind of just say, okay, like what if I could sort of reimagine this from the ground up, right? If we assumed the existence of AI, what does this process look like 10, 20, 50 years from now? Because you're not going to try to sort of do these band-aid automations, right? Sort of RPAs and a sort of buzzword. You're not going to sort of do that, because you should be sort of looking at what you're trying to do and reimagine it from the ground up, right? So an analogy I can use is what does sort of if you imagine the existence of self-driving sort of AI, how would you redesign the cars in the cities and stuff, right? Like that's a very completely new way of thinking about it. And when you sort of think about things in that way, you will come up with ideas that are very different from that sort of bottom-up approach. I mean, I want to be clear, the bottom-up approach is what typically drives immediate impact, but sort of the bigger bets are all driven around this sort of reimagination, right? Like, and another one of my favorite examples is if you imagined existence of a lot of machine learning, computer vision, a whole bunch of different tools in AI, how would like video editing look, right? Because it's a fairly complex process, both from a creative perspective, from the tools that you use. But if you reimagine from ground up, everything from UI to the actions that you have, what you want to do, how you would communicate with this thing, it all looks sort of dramatically different. So what are those sort of opportunities within whatever problem set that you are looking at, right? So I really sort of almost have fun with that one, but it also sort of gets people thinking very, very differently. I mean, and just to kind of show how broad and wide this type of ideation kind of goes, right? Like, if you think about like a golf manufacturer, right? Like that's not naturally a space where you would think that, we can apply a lot of machine learning or AI. Whereas it can't, sort of the truth can't be farther from that, right? Because when you think about their core processes, their organizational structure, their external and internal factors, even their own innovation from design, there's just so many opportunities for them to leverage these tools, right? I was about to say something so boring. Golf's not boring; it's actually fun. But my point is, like, someone who sort of builds, physical things, even for them, this has sort of a massive amount of impact within sort of different areas. And I would sort of advise you to kind of sort of look at this and kind of say, okay, like what else could they have done here, even sort of within some of the areas, we've identified in the past, and this was done as a workshop. But even beyond that, in different categories and different ways of thinking about it. Like if you reimagine even their product from ground up, so if you sort of, again, assume existence of a very powerful AI, like, would you, and they're starting to do this, by the way, but would you build sort of sensors into these clubs that are now actually giving you a whole bunch of insights into how to improve things, right? That's product innovation versus process innovation, which is, how do I make sure that my supply chain is optimized and I know, I'm not overbuilding things or under delivering things, right? So just a ton of opportunity across the board, from operations to health and safety to human resources, and obviously sales and marketing, to optimizing supply chain or forecasting what your demand will be. And when you sort of think about these businesses 5-10 years from now, that they will be doing all of these things. Whereas right now they're still kind of like, wait a minute, do I need to do that? So sort of getting that ideation and pushing them sort of along is a very, very interesting challenge. I also kind of wanted to leave some exercises for you here as we are doing this session of sort of very unique and different types of businesses, to say, how would you think about where machine learning or AI applies within their businesses, right? And these are not really typical businesses you encounter day to day. But what I'm sort of hoping to show you is, we have an opportunity to impact all of these places. There's tons of ideas in all of these places, really anywhere. And the limitation is really just what our approach is and what our creativity is. And the reason why I've kind of structured those questions in this way is to sort of say that oftentimes people feel that, ideas are kind of a light bulb sort of moment, when it couldn't be farther from the truth. We can approach this in a very structured way. It doesn't mean light bulb ideas don't exist, but for most of what we are trying to do, you can have a very structured approach that gives you predictable, repeatable, reliable results in terms of a roadmap of possibilities. So I'll leave, you can kind of make a note of this, or I'll leave this up for a bit, but it will sort of give you a sense of think about sort of what you might be able to do. And we would love to sort of see some of these ideas in the chat, the Google Meet chat. And I'm sort of happy to discuss those, and I'm keen to see ideas that I've certainly not thought of before. So with that, I think we are sort of almost at time as well. So I'll end there. We still have quite a bit of time to please ask questions, discuss some ideas. Obviously, we'll look at those 5 industries and think about opportunities there. And yeah, if you have any questions or concerns or ideas, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Monish. Like always, very insightful and lots of concrete ideas to think about and use. So yeah, as Monish said, if you're on the live streams, please leave your ideas, questions, comments, and about this case study exercise or any other questions that you have in the live chat, and I will relay them. But let's get started by a few questions about things that you talked about, and then a few other discussion points that I have prepared. So the first thing that I noticed in your slides, and that's one of my favorite topics to talk about, is product versus project. So how do you define these two, and how do you know if you're working on a product versus you're doing a project?
Sure. I think for me, it boils down to repeatability, right? So if it is something repeatable that we don't need to keep rebuilding, so to speak, then we would consider that to be a product versus if it is something we are doing as a one-off, then I would consider that to be a project. And again, like a lot of internal things are projects, whereas a lot of external things are products, just by definition, because companies exist to sell products, nothing else. And so the other thing I would just sort of highlight, in particularly in our business, we often end up working for clients on their products, right? So it's a project from our perspective, but product from that perspective. So just to sort of clarify how that plays out.
Definitely. So I guess to sort of try to make sure that I understand what you said, it's about the scope and reusability of the assets that are being created. And you could do projects while you're building products.
For sure, or vice versa, right? So you could have something that starts out as a project and then turns into a product. That actually many technology companies have started that way, and Slack being a very famous example, right? Or even Twitter. Those were internal projects built to deal with specific process challenges that then turned into products.
Definitely. I recently also learned that the founder of Slack is the same person that also founded Tumblr, and Tumblr has a very similar story to Slack, which is amazing.
Yeah, I don't know if it was founder of Tumblr, but certainly some company that they sold to Yahoo. I think Tumblr, some story there makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, like in both cases, they were trying to do video games. But in both cases, that didn't work out. But some internal tool that they built turned into their product. Anyway,
yeah, no, for sure. It's. I think the key there, and when we talk about prioritization, it's being flexible, right? It's being data driven. It's being agile and adaptive, right? And they kind of looked at what they were really doing and said, "Oh, wow, this side project we have is actually a lot more promising. So let's just go do that."
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Another thing that was interesting for me on this slide is the difference between applied and R&D. There are obviously cases that they are very distinctly different, but the majority of the cases fall into that 90% gray area in the middle. So how do you go about thinking which one is which?
I mean, to be honest with you, we don't explicitly think about it in that way, right? But if we have an understanding of what we are trying to do right now, whether with a client or internally, are we trying to do explore this space, and are we comfortably sort of exploring and doing R&D, or are we like the objective was to get something done quickly, right? In my mind, often the difference boils down to speed, risk, confidence. How much do we trust what we have? Because when those things are, you need something done quickly, you have great degree of confidence and trust, and you have low risk. To me, that's applied versus R&D.
Definitely. Okay, so since we're on this slide, I guess to help me understand what is happening here. So let's say you are engaging with stakeholders or users. And you want to ideate, essentially figure out the list of ideas that you should be working on.
Right.
So what is the process here? Essentially, you sit down with them and use some combination of these, items that you're listing here as questions that you would ask them to help them think outside of the box. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, primarily. I mean, I think you want to sort of tee this off properly, because there seems to be, and more so, a prevailing notion of brainstorming sessions are waste of time. All this, why we have a meeting with 5 people sitting around there and just writing, coming up with ideas, right? How valuable is that? So I think you need to establish that value. You need to build that trust the process, and that means also sort of explaining to them what comes after this, right? So, okay, great, we have this long list of ideas. Some are great, some are terrible, some are crazy, some are reasonable, right? We have this great list of ideas. What's going to happen to that, right? So I think being able to sort of telling them that, okay, we're going to take this idea, we're going to prioritize them, right, in a structured way to give you then a list of candidates or one candidate that you really should invest in now, is good. I think you need to sort of convince them that there is sort of an expansive phase of this process where you're coming up with a lot of things, and then there is a narrowing phase where you're going to kind of say, okay, now, we don't want to come up with more ideas. I mean, if you come up with one, that's fine, but we are really trying to narrow and focus. So companies really struggle with it, but sort of building that trust, giving them the transparency of what happens and showing them how this works goes a long way. And then, the execution is sort of getting them in a comfortable, open sort of mindset starts to make a big difference, right? Like, people are naturally very uncomfortable sharing ideas because they think these are bad ideas. So we will often very intentionally start with terrible, wild, crazy ideas to get everybody comfortable. It also leads them to sort of think outside of the box, because inside of the box thinking is very easy. It's outside of the box. Like, how do we get them to see this and understand this? And the last thing I would say, this also often serves as a great education tool, because when they're sort of thinking about these ideas, they'll sort of keep asking this question, like, well, is that AI or is that not? And I often just say it's irrelevant. If it's a good idea, whether that idea needs AI or not has nothing to do with whether you should implement it or not. If anything, and this often happens, people will come up with ideas like, well, why don't we just do that? And that doesn't need AI. I count that as a success.
Definitely. That the last thing that you said is a good segue to the next question that I have, which is, in my experience, oftentimes, and you kind of alluded to it, stakeholders or even users, like even if you're building a consumer-facing application, they're very set in what they want. Like, they don't come to you saying, I want this problem solved. A lot of the time, they come with some variation of the solution they're imagining.
Right.
And that significantly limits their vision and ability to imagine outside of that.
Sure.
Like, I've had, cases that, in my previous roles, client would come to us and say, we want to do NLP. And you're like, why? Like, what problem are you trying to solve? And they have a very, very hard time thinking outside of it. And you can understand why. Like, a lot of the time it is, lack of knowledge. A lot of the time it's just a sexy thing everyone is doing. We should do it too.
It's culture.
Et cetera, right? Exactly. Yeah. So how do you go about establishing that mind shift of, okay, put that away? And I mean more concretely, like, what are the steps that you go through to get them, essentially shake them out of that local minimum they're in?
Yeah, I love that thinking. Like, it's totally sort of a local minimum, right? So great question, and I don't know if I have the full answer, but I'm very comfortable telling people that we're gonna push back, right? Like, we are gonna challenge you on what you have and what you want, and but do it respectfully and do it constructively. And so if they are sort of coming to you with a solution instead of a problem, sort of asking a lot of whys, I've found to be a very simple tactic that gets them sort of outside of the box very quickly. It often annoys them, so you have to do this the right way, right? But just kind of go to it from a very sort of a curious, open-mindedness to just say, hey, like, I just want to learn more about the problem. I often sort of say, at least internally within the team, one of my core values is like, or principle is fall in love with the problem, right? Like, don't spend too much time on the solution. Just fall in love with the problem, because that's how you solve a problem. It's not to focus on the solution, it's to focus on the problem. People don't like to hear that, so I wouldn't necessarily say that to clients who already have a solution in mind. But I would just say, okay, listen, for us to either scope it, to understand it, to make sure it's a success, come up with whatever justification you want, and sort of just say, ask a lot of questions and ask why.
Definitely. Okay, so let's say you manage to convince them that they need to think about it differently. And usually they start from a half-baked, very vaguely concrete idea, and you need to turn that into a range of So there is this, diverge, converge kind of scenario that is going on. Like you first want to explore all the possible ideas and then narrow down on what you want to work on. So in that stage that you're sort of diverging to find out all the possible ideas. So concretely, like, can you walk us through, what are the steps? Like I come to you and I say, I want to do X. So how do you go about, generating a list of ideas that are relevant to where I started?
Yeah, I mean, it is often starting with this exercise, right? Like setting expectations and starting with this exercise, that the goal of this exercise is to come up with a lot of ideas and opportunities, right? Like that is literally the goal. Like the goal is not to narrow it down, converge, focus. The goal is not to assess whether they're good or bad. The goal is to, as you said, diverge or expand your thinking, really. And it's sort of, as I was sort of saying earlier, is to have sometimes multiple of these sessions with different people, different sort of interpersonal dynamics, to get them out of their comfort zone. I mean, sometimes we do like 2-day sessions, right? To get them really, really deep into this. Another sort of great tangible exercise, especially if it's a process-related issue, which almost all of them are, is that customer journey, right? Like get in front of like a big glass window and start putting up sticky notes to say, okay, like what is happening throughout this customer journey? Who is involved? What the steps are? How does this actually really work? And you would be sort of surprised how often, even within the company, people don't know all the details. So again, that's why I kind of go back to this notion of make this a learning exercise more than a ideation exercise, because people are just sort of more comfortable. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to make this more concrete than just, have a clear objective. And the objective is we want to come up with a lot of ideas and opportunities, problems, right? As opposed to, oh no, we want to solve the problem. You're not trying to solve the problem, right? Like those are two different steps. It is come up with a list of questions, ideas, opportunities, challenges, problems, hypotheses, right? Because that will then drive a lot of your work backlog.
Definitely. I guess one of the interesting frameworks that I sort of have found recently, I guess found / kind of put together from a bunch of different resources, is, kind of what you said, like you start by asking them why, to abstract away, because what they're telling you is probably half solution, half problem. Yep. But when you ask them why, you get to the problem. Right. And then an interesting way to generate a lot of ideas is, ask the question as how might we kind of framework, and then ask them, answer that question, and then keep asking them how else, and force them to generate, to tell you a bunch of various ideas that will solve that problem, and then keep repeating that a few layers. And that
I love it.
Yeah, I actually gonna do a session on that framework in a few weeks, and we've been testing it internally for a couple of product ideas that we have, and it works like magic. Like it generates a lot of non-overlapping ideas that cover many different aspects of the problem.
Yeah, no, how might we and how else? I'm gonna have to add them to this slide now, right? So I mean, listen, this slide's already full, so but the other, like, I'm a big fan of design thinking, right? So I mean, this is what design thinking is meant for. It's a terrible name, but it's really a good problem-solving framework, right? So I would, if you're not familiar with sort of design thinking frameworks, I would highly recommend you take a look, because they are, in my experience at least, probably the best way to sort of solve problems where people are involved, right? Because the core of it is really that customer empathy, right? It is empathy. So
definitely, yeah. I mean, 100%. And a big part of the success of what I described is often if you bring in a bunch of people who are potentially your users, and do this exercise with them, because then they are essentially literally telling you what their pain points are in that process.
For sure. I think the hardest part I find is getting people to open up because they don't want to, they don't want to, right? So even one-on-one interviews are often very helpful versus group. Like you just kind of you have to sort of explore that space, right? Like you have to kind of find the peaks and valleys, and without asking people, you just kind of have to go explore it by talking to people, right? And sometimes you can sort of have one meeting and everything is clear. Other times you need 5 group meetings and 20 one-on-one interviews to kind of really get to the bottom of what's happening.
Definitely. So there is a question from YouTube, and I'm going to rephrase it slightly. I do agree with the promise of this question, which is essentially you showed the big slide with many logos of what people are doing in a space.
Right.
So the question is asking, realistically, beyond just having a differentiated data set, what are other types of opportunities that exist? Because it looks like whatever you can imagine, somebody's already doing it based on that slide.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So I think that sentence of whatever you can imagine, somebody's already doing it. I think that's always been true, which by definition means it's always also not been true, right? Because people keep coming up with new things. So it's a limit of your perspective, and there's nothing wrong with that. We all have very limited context, right? So I think I would kind of really encourage you to not think that way, because by definition you're starting in a box. Like, wait a minute, there's finite number of things here, whereas I like to think that there's infinite or approaching infinite number of things here, right? And so there's a lot of things still to be done. Even when somebody is already doing something, right? So doesn't mean they're doing it well, right? Like, doesn't mean they're going to win. I would highly recommend this book by a company called Doblin. They're part of Deloitte, called 10 Types of Innovation, because they really kind of, you want to force yourself out of that notion that because somebody else is doing it, I can't win, or I can't win enough of it. Because there's so many different ways of doing innovation beyond just better technology. And I think history is full of examples where better technology did not win. So I would not sort of limit your thinking in that way. And then the initial part of the question, which is differentiated data, I think that gives you a huge leg up. But I will start to sort of say that a lot of how AI will get deployed over the next 10, 20 years, because I think the fundamental assumption is we all agree, everybody who's joining us today and who's going to watch this, that AI is going to be everywhere. I think how it gets deployed is in very small, subtle ways, but also in what my last bullet there shows, entirely new ways of doing things, right? Again, I would kind of go back to that example of, like, try to reimagine a video editor from the ground up, assuming you have all sorts of extremely powerful AI. Whether you have it or not, whether you have data or not, is almost irrelevant. If you reimagine it, you will find enough there that you can kind of take a shot at it, right? And then you're not just sort of innovating based on your technology or your data. You're also kind of saying, this is a new way of doing this, solving this problem, right? And the classic sort of traditional example people give in sort of when you're talking about this is like Uber, right? They didn't just say, okay, I'm going to go build a better app, right, so that current taxis can use it, right? That's the process improvement. That's that first section kind of thinking, right? You're optimizing what's already there versus kind of completely reimagining and saying, if I assume mobile is everywhere, connectivity is everywhere, and I'm willing to do some illegal things to get there, right? Like you can completely, entirely sort of reimagine things. And I would argue that a lot of those companies that you see on that previous slide, the 1,000 companies, they're still very much focused on taking what's there now and doing incremental addition to it, as opposed to completely reimagining this from ground up. And you can even kind of see that in like how Adobe is applying AI in that space, right? And there's a vast number of places where that's a problem. So I would not, again, I would sort of say, don't limit your thinking by constraints, right? You will always have constraints. They actually allow you to be more creative.
Definitely. I think to sort of regurgitate what you said and add to it, I think I agree with the premise of this question on the part that data is usually the only competitive advantage that you can realistically have. Like the processes, even the technology that you're using, in a lot of cases can be reverse engineered, but collecting the data that is differentiated takes a lot of time. Like in your example, you said they were collecting the data for 15 years, and that's why they were so ahead of everyone else. And you know, differentiated data sets don't come out of nowhere. Like you have to really do your discovery. You have to really find the pain point. You have to start building processes that people find useful, like, you know, in your Uber example. And over time, you're collecting that differentiated data set. Because if you can buy that data set, everyone else can buy it too. So it is just you finding the right problem and collecting the data for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would, again, I'm not disagreeing that differentiated data is private, but I would say there are very plenty of successful startups that have no differentiated data, but they are differentiated across different things, right? Like whether that's user experience, whether that's process, whether that's pricing, whether that's what their go-to-market strategy is, right? Like differentiated data has a prominent place on my slide here because, you know, that's the context I'm operating on this slide. But outside of that, you know, we have our own solutions where we have some differentiated data, but we're building it over time. When we started, we didn't have any. And we were still able to kind of start to build and get some early wins, right? So think of these things as virtuous cycles, not as sort of snapshots, right? And Google, Facebook are perfect examples of this. They use a little bit of data to build something great, which everybody uses, which gives them more data, which lets them build even something great, which gets them even more data, and so on and so forth, right? So climb that ladder and think of it as a cycle, not as, wait, at the starting point, I don't have it, so I can't do it.
100%. That's definitely a better way of what I was trying to say, better way of saying what I was trying to say. All right, so since we have only a couple of minutes left, I just want to quickly throw the last question at you, and hopefully we can wrap that up in 2 minutes, and then we'll have 2 minutes for last words. So, you know, I know that we were not going to talk about prioritization. We were going to talk about ideation, essentially the process of generating many ideas. But, you know, before getting all the way into prioritization, you have generated a list of ideas. What are the ways that you've found that you can very quickly invalidate a bunch of those ideas and shortlist the ones that you want to prioritize?
Great question. And I don't think there's sort of one way, but I think knowing where you want to go and why you want to go there. So like, you know, again, if this is sort of business context, if you kind of know what the objectives were, it lets you throw away a lot of those ideas relatively quickly. It doesn't mean those are not good ideas or they won't help you get to those objectives, but you'll be able to sort of assess that, you know, my ROI on that idea is not all that high, right? And so why don't I start with ones that are better? Whenever we think about MVP, you know, obviously we want to talk about desirability, feasibility, viability, right? And a lot of ideas across one of those three dimensions, it will be almost obvious to you why they should be kicked out because they rate poorly on that dimension. I would sort of expand desirability, feasibility, viability into something a little bit more specific to what you're trying to do. So you can sort of look at ROI, time to market, risk, data. Depending on the problem, you might end up with like 8-9 criterias. But once you have those, like to go from, let's say, 50 ideas to like 7 or 5 is generally a very, very rapid exercise. Like that does not take that long.
Definitely. All right, we are almost out of time. So do you want to just say some last words and any call to action you have, and we can wrap it up?
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you everybody. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We would obviously love to see answers to sort of some of these case studies on comments, and engage and respond there. And otherwise, you are sort of welcome to reach out. I mean, I do think in some of the questions that you asked me today, Amir, give me the sense that ideation is where I think people are making a lot of assumptions. Don't be limited. Like the nature of ideation is that you want to be as expansive and broad and creative as possible. So don't put artificial constraints on it.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Just last question. Is email the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah.
I know you have your email there. Okay.
For sure. Yeah.
So yeah, audience or anyone who watches this afterwards, please reach out to Monish with your questions or comments or ideas. And thank you so much again for spending the time with us today. I have no idea how the past hour went, but it was really enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amir. Thanks.
Problem. And guys, on the folks on the live stream, please go to ai.science. You can see a lot of events like this. You have other product sessions coming up in the next few weeks, and hope to see you there. Thank you.